And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. You know, I come to Washington for 2 days. And look what happens. I feel like I have to get out of here before the earth cracks open and swallows this place whole. Was it me? Today has just been a cascade of what would be generally seen as absolutely apocalyptic news in any other presidency. In the Trump presidency, maybe we just think of this as a slightly rockier than usual Thursday. But any one of the things that happened today would be written into the history of any other modern presidency as one of its worst days or the start of the end. But let's start tonight with the resignation of the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis. This is his resignation letter. It's dated today, December 20th, 2018. It's on Defense Department letterhead. Dear Mr. President, I have been privileged to serve as our country's 26th Secretary of Defense, which has allowed me to serve alongside our men and women of the department in defense of our citizens and our ideals. One core belief I've always held is that our strength as a nation is inextricably linked to the strength of our unique and comprehensive system of alliances and partnerships. While the U.S. remains the indispensable nation in the free world, we cannot protect our interests or serve that role effectively without maintaining strong alliances and showing respect to those allies. We must use all tools of American power to provide for the common defense, including providing effective leadership to our alliances. NATO's 29 democracies demonstrated that strength and their commitment to fighting alongside us following the 9/11 attack on America. The Defeat ISIS coalition of 74 nations is further proof. Similarly, I believe we must be resolute and unambiguous in our approach to those countries whose strategic interests are increasingly in tension with ours. It's clear that China and Russia, for example, want to shape a world consistent with their authoritarian model, gaining veto authority over other nations' economic, diplomatic, and security decisions to promote their own interests at the expense of their neighbors, America, and our allies. My views on treating allies with respect and also being clear-eyed about malign actors are strongly held and informed by over 4 decades of immersion in these issues. Because you have the right to have a Secretary of Defense whose views are better aligned with yours on these and other subjects, I believe it is right for me to step down from my position. The end date for my tenure is February 28th, 2019. And it is signed without salutation, James N. Mattis. This letter of resignation today was not released by the White House. It was released by the Pentagon. I can't imagine the White House would have ever released this if the Pentagon didn't do it, just because there's no lack of clarity here. I mean, this was a resignation in protest against the president and his behavior. At least that's how this reads to me. I mean, there's no hint that Secretary Mattis was fired or that his resignation was because he wanted to spend more time writing symphonies or something. I mean, he has resigned in protest over these 2 clear issues, treating allies with respect and, as he puts it, quote, being clear-eyed about malign actors. Beyond this blunt letter, though, I think another way you can tell this wasn't the president firing the defense secretary is because this happened today in person, man to man. The defense secretary, Jim Mattis, apparently went to the White House, met with the president in person today, and he handed him this resignation. Now, in contrast, when President Trump has fired people in his administration, I think without exception, he has always had someone else do it for him. He does not do that in person. So this is the first resignation in protest in the Trump cabinet. And that makes it a first. But at another level, this is sort of just another one of those moments. I'm not going to put up the big wall behind me again, listing all the high-level departures from this administration. Honestly, who has the time? But even if we're just talking about the cabinet, just the cabinet, we have had the health secretary resign in scandal. We've had the EPA head resign in scandal. We've just had the interior secretary resign in scandal. And in terms of resigning in scandal, we're not going to put him up there yet because he's still there. But if you want to say tick-tock over the next cabinet secretary likely to resign in scandal, I think safest bets are on Labor Secretary Alex Acosta, thanks to the new revelations about his role in personally arranging a sweetheart no prosecution deal for an accused, unbelievably prolific serial child rapist. So Alex Acosta right now still at the Labor Department, but keep your markers on him. And Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, honestly, has a whole bunch of legal issues hanging off his bumper like a bunch of tin cans after a cheap wedding. But for now, Acosta and Wilbur Ross are still there. But still, inside the first half term of this president, we have already had 3 members of the cabinet resign in scandal. We have had the Secretary of State fired by the president, and the VA secretary fired by the president, and the Attorney General fired by the president. We have had 1 member of the cabinet, the UN Secretary Nikki Haley, apparently resign without real explanation, but there remains some opacity around her departure. And now today we got this first. We got a cabinet secretary resigning in protest of the president's behavior and beliefs and being overt about that being the reason for his departure. And again, that's just the cabinet, right? Keep in mind that in the midst of the ever erupting chaos right now in this town, the president has just fired his 2nd White House chief of staff and is about to bring on his 3rd. And a brand new White House counsel just started last week. I'm sure he hasn't been busy at all this past couple of weeks with how the news has been. The Dow Jones today dropped nearly another 500 points. That brings the stock market to a 14-month low. We are now on the precipice of a bear market. Tomorrow, I think it is fair to say, it is more likely than not that the federal government is going to shut down indefinitely, even though the Republican Party continues to have unified control over the White House and the House and the Senate. Despite Republicans controlling all the levers of power in Washington right now, they apparently are not on track to pass a bill that will keep the government open, which the president will also see fit to sign. So the bills the president will sign won't pass the Senate, and the bills that will pass the Senate, the president won't sign. So one of the things we're actually going to be trying to figure out tonight is the absence factor. Tomorrow, the government will just shut down right in time for Christmas, which will result in the sudden furloughing of tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of workers, and the grinding to a halt of big parts of what the federal government does. They will try to pass something in the Senate tomorrow to avert that. But members of Congress and even senators have been fleeing this town today like shoplifters running from a loud checkout alarm. And so one of the things we actually have to mathematically factor in here is whether or not there will still be enough of them around to cast the votes that will keep the government open, provided that they can agree on something that they'd like to vote on. So, like I said, a lot going on. We are going to need a lot of help tonight figuring out what's going on here with a lot of these different stories that are evolving. What's going on with the shutdown, which frankly is now imminent. What just happened with the defense secretary resigning in protest, given the stated reasons for his resignation, given what appears to be the immediate precipitating event here, which appears to have been President Trump's abrupt unilateral Twitter announcement that all U.S. troops will immediately leave Syria. One of the things we're going to need expert help on tonight with regard to that story is whether Secretary Mattis resigning in this way might be expected to cause a greater standoff of some kind between the president and the U.S. military. So we're going to get help on that tonight from an excellent Pentagon-based reporter who is right here. We're going to be speaking with her in just a moment. But we're also going to be talking with a presidential historian tonight who has been looking today at what kind of precedent there is in our history for this kind of thing and what that might tell us about the prospects for some sort of more dramatic split between the Defense Department and the president. Does that end up pulling a little bit at the constitutional seams between our military and our civilian government? And I don't mean to just jump right on it too abruptly, but one of the things that is now in the foreground and not at all in the background of all of this news is the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, today praising President Trump for his announcement that he would pull U.S. troops out of Syria immediately. Vladimir Putin, of course, thinks that Syria should be Russia's outpost in the Middle East and everybody else should butt out and leave them to it. Today, at his annual press conference, one a year, whether he needs it or not, today, President Putin praised President Trump for pulling U.S. troops out of Syria. But it was interesting. As soon as he was asked about that decision by President Trump to pull U.S. troops out of Syria, the way he responded was by praising that decision, but then immediately pivoting. He said, well, basically, you know, we think it's good news. We're happy that he's pulling out of Syria. We'll believe it when we see it, though. The United States has been in Afghanistan for 17 years, and they always say they're withdrawing there. That was his pivot today. Within hours, the Wall Street Journal was first to report that President Trump has also ordered about half the U.S. troops in Afghanistan, about 7,000 troops, home right now, within weeks. Another sudden announcement today, on top of the sudden announcement yesterday about the unilateral and complete withdrawal from Syria. So we're going to have a leading member of the Foreign Relations Committee here to talk about that in just a moment. But this all does come in the immediate aftermath of the Trump administration also announcing the relaxing of sanctions on a key Russian oligarch who's linked closely with the Kremlin. That oligarch's company, which is the second largest aluminum company in the world, has been sanctioned by the U.S. government because of Russia's behavior towards Ukraine, among other issues. That second largest aluminum company in the world will now no longer be sanctioned by the U.S. government. They're being released from those sanctions, which, of course, will be a boon to the Russian economy. That is a huge Russian company. But the way the sanctions deal was lifted, the oligarch himself, Oleg Deripaska, he's the same Putin-linked oligarch to whom Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort offered private briefings during the presidential campaign. Mr. Deripaska will be allowed to divest, essentially, from his aluminum companies, so the companies can shed these U.S. sanctions. But the way he's going to divest from his aluminum companies is by shifting his shares to a Russian state-owned bank that is controlled by the Kremlin, and that is a bank called VTB. And that is the bank that was reportedly the financing agent for Trump Tower Moscow, the Russian real estate deal about which the president's personal lawyer just pled guilty for lying to Congress about it. The same Russian real estate deal that prosecutors say extended well into the presidential election campaign while the president lied about it and kept secret that he was pursuing that deal. It's a deal that prosecutors now say could have netted the president's company hundreds of millions of dollars from Russian sources. So these things are all just happening at the same time. The same day the president announces that, surprise, the U.S. is pulling out of Syria and leaving it to Russia after all, his administration dropped sanctions on the Russian oligarch associated with his convicted felon campaign chairman in a deal made possible by the Kremlin-controlled Russian bank that was in line to provide the financing for his secret real estate deal in Russia that he was working on throughout the campaign that could have been worth hundreds of millions of dollars to him. And then the day after that, the president of Russia says, yeah, that's good about Syria, but you know what? You may want to get out of Afghanistan, too. And within hours, the president has announced that, too. And now the defense secretary has resigned in protest and, well, the government's likely going to shut down tomorrow. But on top of that, if you think that the pressure on the president over the Russia issue may be driving any of this, driving the president's behavior and decisions as president, maybe driving the stress in the White House about the investigation into the Russia matter and what it may turn up and what kind of pressure it may put on the president and his family, today, on top of all of it, or maybe intrinsic to all of it, today was also the day that they really just made their move in the Justice Department. Now, you may have followed the twists and turns of this over the course of the day today, but rather than go through the ways this story changed over the course of the day and how the Justice Department put out an initial exculpatory story and then had to retract it and later put out the real story after anonymous officials corrected the record about what really happened, after going through what was a very weird day today in terms of the Justice Department letting out this information, where we have ended up is serious. And actually, just to sum it up, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read you the lead that was just posted tonight by the excellent reporter Charlie Savage at the New York Times, because I think he nuts this up pretty perfectly after a twisty day on this story. Quote, Matthew Whitaker, who was installed last month as acting attorney general by President Trump, has cleared himself to supervise the special counsel's investigation, rejecting the recommendation of career Justice Department ethics specialists that he recuse himself. The development came soon after the disclosure that the president's nominee for Attorney General, William Barr, had written a memo this spring in which he strongly criticized one of the main lines of inquiry by the special counsel, Robert Mueller, whether Mr. Trump had committed obstruction of justice. Disclosure of the memo raised questions about whether Barr would order Robert Mueller to shut down that component of the inquiry if the Senate confirms Barr as Attorney General. Together, the developments underscored the potential threats to Mr. Mueller's ability to complete his work without interference at a time when his inquiry appears to be drawing closer to the White House and to the president's most trusted associates. Charlie Savage then quotes Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, the top Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, who said today, quote, "It is becoming pretty clear that the president is basing his choices for leadership at the Justice Department on candidates' criticism of the Mueller investigation. We can all see what's happening here." So buckle up. It has been a day. At the rate things are going, it may be a night as well. We're going to be joined by the incoming chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the House tonight as well to try to make some sense and put in context some of these major new developments. But on the issue of the Russia investigation, after a rip-roaring couple of weeks of very dramatic courtroom developments driven by the special counsel, the mask did sort of get ripped off today in terms of how the president intends to try to get at the special counsel's investigation from inside the Justice Department. Simultaneously, the Russian government has just gotten a huge series of very, very, very expensive gifts from the president in very quick succession, including at least one that was so expensive it cost him the resignation of his defense secretary tonight. And so let's start there with some expert help. Joining us now is Courtney Kube, NBC News national security reporter. Courtney, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, what's going on? How's your day? Pretty normal?
Yes, it's holidays, lots of shopping.
Is there any question about why Secretary Mattis resigned tonight? Is there any ambiguity about whether he was jumped or if he was pushed?
No, defense officials are saying that he was not pushed out, that this was his decision. And there have really been a series of decisions that have been made by the president recently that have been counter to Secretary Mattis's advice. Throughout the course of Secretary Mattis's time at the Pentagon, actually, there have been a lot of decisions, but the ones most recently have been the most egregious for Mattis. And those were choosing General Milley, Mark Milley, to be the next chairman against Secretary Mattis's advice. That was just earlier this month.
Is that such an important issue to him because he's strongly against Milley, or just because he felt like it was disrespectful or inappropriate for the president to reject his choice of somebody else?
I think it was a combination of both. The president has the authority. It's his decision who he wants to nominate, but usually they take the Secretary of Defense's advice pretty seriously. In this case, Secretary Mattis really wanted General Goldfein, the Air Force Chief of Staff, rather than General Milley. So that started the month out. Then there came this surprise Syria announcement, which actually was, over the course of the last week or so, this was a discussion. President Trump has wanted to take troops out of Syria for some time. Mm-hmm. He didn't hide that in the spring when he wanted to. Secretary Mattis, along with others, were able to change his mind on that. Well, they started talking about it again. What was particularly surprising was how it came out and the fact that President Trump has decided to take all troops out in such a quick and rapid succession. And then that, of course, comes, 24 hours later, we hear that the White House has asked the Pentagon for plans for withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Within weeks, 7,000 troops.
Within weeks. It would be, it's not clear. Nothing has been decided. But the fact that they're asking for this series of plans, and it sure seems like the president has decided he wants to go down in the number of troops there. Mm-hmm. When I was in Afghanistan in October, I got a real sense that there is a limited time that they have to keep this 14 to 15,000 that are there right now. It seems like the most likely next course of action would be more of a counter-terror force that would be there going after al-Qaeda and ISIS Khorasan and Taliban and whatnot, and less of a focus on the training mission, which, of course, as we heard in Secretary Mattis's resignation letter tonight, the training mission is the NATO mission. Mm-hmm. That's the partner mission that Secretary Mattis keeps going to the NATO allies and saying, this is why we need to stay in this mission. We need more money. We need to fund the training. So if the U.S. is, in fact, going to pull out of that as well,
So, when I was reacting, like everybody, to this news from Secretary Mattis, immediately read the resignation letter, saw the way that he articulated this, but just started jotting notes to myself, like, all right, what are all the things on which we've seen Secretary Mattis either explicitly or implicitly disagree with the president on? And it's the stuff you mentioned, but it's everything from the president talking smack about NATO and talking down NATO, right? The president wanting a military parade in Washington, D.C., the ban on transgender soldiers, the Iran deal, that weird Space Force debacle. Mm-hmm. Just last month, he told the president no on arming the U.S. troops sent to the border.
Yes.
To enforce immigration issues. Is this cumulative? You're talking about what was particularly important about the Joint Chiefs decision and the Syria decision, and now the Afghanistan decision has happened apparently in the wake of this. And I see why those would be key issues for him. But essentially, is this a pile of things that just grew too large, or were those qualitatively different issues?
So these are very specific security issues. So the ban on transgender service members, having a parade. I think these are things that Secretary Mattis had an opinion on, but he wasn't willing to go to bat with them to the point of having to resign.
Having a confrontation over them.
Exactly.
Right? Even if he did slow walk them.
He
or make sure
totally
they didn't
did. There were other ones, too. I mean, there were ones that weren't as well reported, like when President Trump wanted to pull all dependents off the Korean Peninsula.
Right.
Secretary Mattis just slow-rolled that. But in this case, if you look at Syria, there's only maybe 2,000 ISIS fighters left in Syria. They're in a relatively small pocket. In the next couple months, the Syrian Democratic Forces in the U.S. could probably have cleaned that out. So why now?
Yeah.
All this is what this does right now is it leaves them there for the potential for them to maybe to grow, maybe to be able to start inspiring attacks outside of the region in the U.S., in Europe, something like that. That's one of the big concerns. But then there's also the concern that this is going against the Syrian Democratic Forces, the YPG, the Arabs who have been fighting there, who have been a very consistent, strong partner to the U.S. and the coalition, and this is abandoning them.
With Mattis leaving in the way that he's leaving and leaving over these issues as you are describing them, do you think it's possible that this may precipitate some wider break or additional resignations or some bigger confrontation or chasm between the White House and the Pentagon?
So one of the first things I started asking about when I heard about this after the shock wore off was, does this mean that we're going to see some general officers resign as well?
That's exactly what
imagine if you're the commander of Operation Inherent Resolve, which is the Iraq and Syria mission, and you're pulling all of your troops out and you're abandoning this ally who you're spending all this time building a relationship with. Imagine if you're the head of CENTCOM right now. So I wouldn't be surprised. I haven't heard about anything, but that's really the next big thing that I'm looking for is, are we going to see military resignations over this?
Yes. NBC News national security reporter Courtney Kube, thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you for being here on camera. But thank you also for being such help to me and my producers every damn day that we cover stuff and need to call you for your help in understanding this stuff. Thank you.
The best team. I love you guys.
Okay. Senator Chris Murphy is going to be joining us live in just a moment. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.